She was placed on display at a talent market by human traffickers, facing a crowd of farm owners looking to buy laborers. The girl looked utterly terrified. Her thin, fragile frame gave her no advantage at all compared to the tall and strong adults around her. Even when her price was lowered to almost nothing, no one was willing to take her away. But at that moment, a well-dressed gentleman seemed to take an interest in her, and just like that, the girl was bought by an indigo plantation owner. But what the man wanted wasn't a worker. He simply wanted to shape her into an object to release his frustrations. If Fantine from Les Miserables represents the tears and suffering of oppressed women, then Aminata in this story embodies a soul scarred by obsession yet awakening to her true identity. The show we're talking about today is the Book of Negroes, adapted from Lawrence Hill's novel of the same name. Our story begins in distant West Africa, where Aminata, influenced by her mother, becomes a midwife. Her father is a devout believer, and their family lives peacefully within their tribe. But fate can be cruel, and one fateful outing changes their lives forever. A faint rustling in the grass catches her father's attention. Sensing danger nearby, he quickly draws his weapon from his waist. Sure enough, men with the same skin color suddenly rush out of the forest. People who once belonged to their own tribe, but have now been bought off by foreigners to capture their own kind. Their leader even holds a musket, and to avoid being taken, Aminata's father fights back with all his might, but his daughter is soon restrained by the traffickers. Her mother, in a desperate attempt to save her, is struck on the back of the head and dies instantly. Her father too is unable to escape his fate. Aminata loses both her parents and is chained like the others, becoming just another captive to be sold. Their home village, once full of life, is reduced to ashes by fire. In 18th century Africa, iron chains and shackles were the cruel symbols every enslaved traveler had to bear. Aminata hasn't had a drop of water for 2 days. When a boy about her age notices her suffering and offers her a small drink, she grabs the water skin and gulps down the precious sweetness as if her life depends on it. Around her, others too weak to keep walking collapse to the ground. Then, something even more horrifying happens to prevent slowing down the march. The leader signals one of the men, who takes out an axe and strikes down the exhausted captives lying on the ground. The rest of the group continues their grim journey, stopping briefly to rest under the few trees they can find. The boy offers Aminata a mango, but a nearby woman, filled with jealousy, turns back and spits in defiance at him, her resentment clear as day. She then reaches out to demand the mango from Aminata, but the girl refuses to give up the precious food she's finally managed to get. The woman, unable to hold back her anger, suddenly lunged forward to snatch it away. Perhaps, in the face of survival, all sense of morality loses its weight. Aminata was planning to take this brief moment of rest to pray for her fate, but her small act of faith enraged one of the traffickers behind her. The man stormed over and lashed her back 5 times with his whip. Her cries of pain were so heart-wrenching that even the other captives couldn't bear to look. Then, the same woman who had fought her over the mango seemed to feel remorse. She came over and offered Aminata some comfort and care. As they passed through a nearby tribe, the locals threw garbage at them, a cruel reminder that even within Africa, people of the same blood could still look down on one another. After days and nights of endless walking, they finally encountered a kind of person they had never seen before. To the captives, the color white symbolized an evil spirit, filling Aminata with a fear unlike anything she had ever known. Pushing through the thick forest, their eyes met a vast expanse of ocean. The locals called it the Great River, a river that seemed to touch the sky, but they didn't know that across that river was no paradise, it was a living nightmare. By the shore, crowds of captured people were already gathered, waiting for the dreaded sailing ships. At this point, the traffickers had completed their deal, officially washing their hands of the captives. But before boarding, there was one more cruel ritual. The foreigners used burning irons to mark the captives, branding them as slaves. The woman bit back her screams, glaring at the man who had burned her with eyes full of hatred. Aminata too couldn't escape this fate. The scorching iron seared into her skin, and her cries of pain echoed across the sea. When she woke again, she was in a small wooden boat, drifting far away from her homeland. Ahead of them loomed a massive slave ship, from which came chilling screams of agony, the sound of punishment for those who dared to resist. Then came the second group of captives. The man in charge held a register and began inspecting the women carefully, making sure they were fit to fetch a good price. When it was the second man's turn, he resisted fiercely, even biting one of the crew members. That act enraged the officer, who ordered his men to throw the young man overboard. using his death as a warning to the rest, and the message was immediately understood. After that, the women silently endured their inspection, and when the officer found nothing wrong, he nodded in satisfaction. But the third woman wasn't as lucky. She was pregnant, and on a ship like this, she would be considered nothing but a burden. As the crew prepared to throw her into the sea, Aminata quickly intervened, telling them she had helped her mother deliver babies and could take care of the woman. Impressed by her quick thinking, the officers spared the pregnant woman and even released Aminata's chains. When all the captives were finally selected, they gathered on deck, gazing at the fading outline of their homeland, their hearts filled with confusion and sorrow, not knowing if they would ever see home again. Once aboard, their first task was to wash with rainwater, a precious resource in the middle of the sea. They endured the cold, stinging rain, huddling together for warmth. When the storm cleared and the sun returned, they were forced to dry off under the burning heat before being herded into the dark lower deck. The conditions below were unbearable. Shackled and packed tightly, the captives could barely move, and the stench of waste filled the air. As Aminata pushed forward through the foul-smelling darkness, a man grabbed her arm. She soon realized these were fellow captives, and among them were a few young women like herself. They introduced themselves, reminisced about home, even shared small jokes, their laughter cutting through a little of the gloom. Amid this moment of brief comfort, Aminata, wise beyond her years, reminded them all of one thing: they must survive, no matter what. Because of the small privileges granted to her by the foreigners, she was allowed to walk freely on deck, but that so-called freedom was nothing more than a trap. One day, she was brought to the captain's private cabin. Confused, she asked what he wanted, and the captain, wearing a smug smile, began to take off his coat. After a few words, he tried to lure her toward the bed. Aminata, uncertain but cautious, played along just enough. As the captain's smile grew darker, realizing his sinister intent, she quickly dodged as he tried to touch her. Seeing her fierce resistance, the captain backed off, his plan exposed. Embarrassed, he left the cabin in defeat. Left alone, Aminata wasted no time. She picked up a sharp tool from the bedside, grabbed a knife from the table, and secretly handed them to the shackled captives below. What were they planning to do next? The scene shifts, and to ease the boredom of the long voyage, the crew orders the captives to play African music on deck. Soon, a sailor begins to dance, slowly approaching a confused young woman. Before she can react, he pulls her tightly into his arms. She is clearly about to become his target of abuse. The other captives watch in silent fury, their jaws clenched, yet powerless to intervene. Moments later, the woman is dragged away like an animal, her chains rattling as she's pulled into the cabin. But just as the man loses himself in his act, she suddenly draws a sharp blade and slashes it across his neck with full force. Her eyes burn with hatred and rage, emotions crashing over the dying man like a violent storm. At the same time, Aminata hands the key she had prepared to the boy. Their uprising against the foreigners is about to begin. The assaulted woman steps out of the cabin, weapons still in hand, while the white sailors continue dancing joyfully to the drums. Unaware that disaster is creeping ever closer, the man in charge of the music quickly understands her silent signal. Gripping his knife tightly, he moves in rhythm, disguising his intent beneath the dance. The other captives, seeing their moment arrive, begin unlocking their chains one by one. On the surface, everything looks peaceful, but as the drums grow louder, they suddenly strike. Hearing the commotion, more sailors rush onto the deck with rifles, firing wildly into the crowd. Within moments, the captives' rebellion is crushed. The uprising has failed. The two leaders are tied to wooden posts and executed on the spot, their bodies later thrown into the sea as a grim warning to the rest. After 10 long weeks at sea, the surviving captives finally set foot on the land of South Carolina. People throw trash at them as they pass, and the so-called refined women look at them with cold, judgmental eyes. They are led into a damp, dark cellar, where they must wait until the next day to be auctioned off to plantation owners. The air is cold and wet. The captives huddle together for warmth, their bare bodies trembling. Aminata clings to the boy, sharing what little comfort they can find. A white overseer brings in a bucket of scraps, signaling that this is their meal, and immediately everyone rushes forward in desperation. Through the chaos, the boy manages to grab a bit of food and hands it to Aminata, but the chill is unbearable. The girl's mind begins to drift, her body numbed by the cold, slipping into a dreamlike daze.
Is my face on fire?
In her fragile imagination, she sees a beam of bright light shining down upon her and the boy as if heaven itself had heard her silent prayer. The next morning, the captives are smeared with pig fat to make their skin shine, giving them the appearance of being healthy for sale. Soon, Aminata's friend is the first to be placed on the auction block. His starting price is only £7. After a few rounds of bidding, it rises barely to 8, and just like that, the boy is sold and separated from Aminata forever. Whether they will ever see each other again remains unknown. Next, it's Aminata's turn. The trafficker praises her desperately, but her frail figure makes her less desirable than the others. In the end, an indigo plantation owner offers only £5, far below the seller's expectations. And so, Aminata is taken off the stage. The plantation owner studies her closely, and from his gaze, it's clear that his intentions are far from pure. Aminata and several other captives are bound and taken to the indigo plantation. Exhausted from hunger, cold, and the long journey, she finally collapses. Fortunately, she is discovered by a kind-hearted maid, a woman who has no children of her own and treats Aminata as if she were her daughter, caring for her tenderly. Time passes. 8 years go by in this place. When Aminata awakens one morning, she is no longer the frail little girl she once was, but a graceful young woman, exactly what the plantation owner had been waiting for. When he first bought her at such a low price, his intentions had already been dark. But one night, the maid brings unexpected news. The boy Aminata had long dreamed of has found his way here. Overwhelmed with emotion, she runs through the woods, her heart pounding with anticipation. After all these years, they finally meet again. It's not just fate, it's a miracle, proof that they both managed to survive in a world built on cruelty. The young man gives Aminata a bright, colorful headscarf, and at her request, gently ties it around her head himself. They stand together like two lovers lost in time, hearts beating fast, cherishing the rare warmth of reunion. But moments of happiness are fleeting. To avoid being caught, the man promises to meet her again soon before slipping away into the night. Even though their time together was brief, the excitement keeps Aminata awake until dawn, her heart racing with hope and longing. But the next morning, terrible news arrived. The plantation owner had learned that a black man had been asking questions about Aminata. The selfish white master immediately ordered a servant to summon her. Everyone knew what was about to happen, but no one could do anything to stop it. Filled with dread, Aminata walked toward her master's room, unaware of the horror waiting inside. When she entered the study, the master, exuding the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, began to touch her as if she were his possession. Though Aminata's heart burned with anger and disgust, she could only endure in silence, for in a world ruled by white power, resistance meant death. Her stifled cries echoed through the hallway, and when it was over, she lay on the floor, broken and trembling, while the master adjusted his clothes and walked away as though nothing had happened. Moments later, a fellow slave rushed in, worried for her condition. He wanted to help, but in those days, such tragedies were so common that even words of comfort seemed hollow and meaningless. When Aminata returned to her room, the person she couldn't stop thinking about was the man she loved. The maid who had watched her grow up had long feared this day would come, and quietly gave Aminata some medicine to help cleanse the filth forced upon her body. In the days that followed, Aminata seized every chance she could to read. She firmly believed that knowledge was the only weapon that could one day set her free, the only hope for a better life beyond the walls of this cruel world. One night, she met with her beloved again in the small grove. It was their secret haven, their brief escape from reality. The man never judged her for what had been done to her, and as the firelight flickered beside them, their love and sorrow finally broke through the silence. That night, surrounded by the blessings of their fellow enslaved people, they held a simple wedding ceremony. Everyone sang and danced, as if for a moment, they were back in the land of their ancestors. A few months later, Aminata's belly began to swell. When the plantation owner found out, he demanded to know whose child it was. Aminata dared not tell the truth, but the man she loved understood everything, and soon, the nightmare began. The furious plantation owner dragged Aminata into the open yard, ordered another slave to bring the man's razor, and gathered everyone on the plantation to witness what he called justice. In front of the entire crowd, he took a pair of scissors and began cutting off Aminata's thick hair, one piece at a time, taunting her by waving the strands before her eyes, inflicting humiliation with every snip. After a while, she was left looking nothing like herself, exhausted, broken, and stripped of dignity. The man continued to curse her viciously, his voice filled with rage, while Aminata trembled uncontrollably, feeling as though a demon stood behind her, crushing every last bit of her strength. 2 months passed in painful silence, and then, With screams that shook the air, Aminata gave birth to her child. When the plantation owner approached and nervously lifted the blanket to look at the baby, the color of the child's skin shocked him. His face darkened with disappointment. It was clear this was not his child. After he left in anger, the maid quietly warned Aminata to stay vigilant. No one could know what the man might do to the baby. From that day on, Aminata could feel the master's gaze constantly following her as she worked in the fields. Cold and predatory, she tried to ignore it, hoping the danger would pass, but that night, the unthinkable happened. As she slept, she turned over and suddenly realized the cradle beside her was empty. Her heart froze with terror. In the distance, she heard the faint cry of her baby echo through the night. When she rushed toward the sound, she saw the plantation owner standing there, making a deal, and in one cruel, heartless moment, he handed her baby away. It was a scene of unbearable pain, a mother and child torn apart, forever divided by greed and brutality. In that cruel age, tragedies like Aminata's were far too common. Losing a child was like losing all hope for life itself. She began to sink into deep sorrow, and soon, even more misfortune followed. To curry favor with a Jewish merchant, the plantation owner decided to sell Aminata at a low price. By then, after 10 long years on the plantation, Aminata's heart was numb. She had long lost any attachment to that place. On the day of her departure, she embraced the kind maid who had once cared for her, both of them in tears, unsure if they would ever see each other again. Aminata left the plantation and sat beside the Jewish merchant on the journey ahead. The man treated her with an unusual level of respect, and before long, they arrived in the northern city of Manhattan. The merchant and his wife did not treat Aminata like a slave. They even prepared a comfortable room for her, and for the first time in her life, Aminata felt what safety truly meant. But by the late 18th century, even in the North, the slave trade was still thriving, and as if that weren't enough, a deadly epidemic had begun spreading through the city. Tragically, before long, the merchant's wife caught smallpox, and their 4-year-old son soon fell ill as well. In the face of disease, humanity often feels powerless. The merchant's wife eventually passed away. During his darkest days, Aminata comforted the grieving man with genuine compassion, offering him the care he so desperately needed. But one day, while cleaning the house, Aminata accidentally found a document, and inside it, a horrifying secret. It revealed that her infant daughter, the one taken from her years ago, had been sold through the very same merchant who was now her employer. He had been the one supplying children to her old plantation owner, trading lives for profit. The truth hit her like lightning. The man she thought kind and moral was in fact a wolf in sheep's clothing. The merchant tried to justify himself, claiming that he had only done it to give both mother and child a chance at new lives. But instead of gratitude, his words provoked Aminata's fury. In anger, he struck her hard across the face. This time, Aminata did not submit. She fought back without hesitation, and in that moment, she swore to leave and live for herself at last. Meanwhile, the sound of gunfire echoed across the American continent. The Revolutionary War had begun. Seizing the chaos as her chance, Aminata escaped to a free black community known as Canvas Town. Seeking freedom and a new beginning, there, she worked as a midwife, earning the respect of her neighbors and making new friends. The owner of a local inn, a black man himself, admired her intelligence and education, and he offered her both a job and a safe place to stay. One night, against all odds, Aminata was reunited with her long-lost husband. He had fled the plantation after learning she was gone and, after countless hardships, had made his way to New York. It wasn't just luck that brought them back together, it was destiny refusing to let them part. That night, the two found warmth again in each other's arms. Later, the couple sat at the bedside, reminiscing about the child who had been sold away.
Linda said she died. The box got...
Though her husband refused to believe the Jewish merchant's words, he was still consumed by grief. 2 months passed, and the war between the British and American forces grew fiercer. Because there were many British loyalists in New York, their attitude toward black people began to shift. The British, hoping to win support, made a bold promise to escaped slaves. Anyone who joined their cause would not only be freed from bondage but also granted land and citizenship in a new colony, Nova Scotia. This promise spread like wildfire. Many enslaved people seized the opportunity, donning red uniforms to fight for the British. Through the innkeeper's introduction, Aminata was recruited by Captain John Clarkson to record the names of freed black loyalists in a ledger known as the Book of Negroes. It was a record of all the formerly enslaved Africans who had escaped their rebel masters and been promised freedom by the British before their evacuation to Nova Scotia following the British defeat. But even with so many black soldiers joining the fight, the British eventually lost. And now, The only hope for survival was to flee New York for Canada. Yet just as Aminata and her husband were preparing to board the ship, they were stopped by officials. The record she had provided identified her as a runaway slave, one still wanted by her former plantation owner. The British officer tried to intervene on her behalf, but as the defeated side, his authority was meaningless. Aminata was arrested, and her husband was forced to leave her behind. She was thrown into a dark prison cell. The innkeeper, hearing of her fate, came to see her, his face full of worry. No one knew whether this poor woman would survive what was to come. Soon, the trial for runaway slaves began. At the judge's request, the plaintiff entered the courtroom, none other than the indigo plantation owner himself, Aminata's former master. A pair of evil eyes. Aminata could never forget them. The man presented a purchase receipt to the judge and lied, claiming he had once lent some of his property, Aminata included, to a Jewish merchant. He insisted that she had escaped to the north on her own. Faced with the judge's questions, Aminata knew in her heart that she legally belonged to the Jewish merchant, but she had no proof to defend herself. The situation quickly turned against her. At that crucial moment, the black innkeeper stepped forward, asking the judge to delay the verdict for 2 more hours so he could find evidence. The man's reputation in the community was excellent, so the judge agreed without hesitation. Aminata was sent back to her cell to await the final decision, silently praying her friend would return in time. But during this brief wait, her former white master bribed the jailer and came to her cell. Pretending to show kindness, he spoke with false affection, urging her to give up her anger and return with him to Virginia. Yet Aminata could never forget how he had once humiliated and violated her. Those wounds would never heal. His fake compassion was nothing but useless deceit. Soon, the 2 hours passed, and the innkeeper had still not returned. Just as the judge was about to announce the verdict, the door burst open. The man had made it back. Even more surprising, he had brought the Jewish merchant with him, perhaps out of guilt or a sudden awakening of conscience. The merchant produced the purchase documents without hesitation. He admitted that Aminata was indeed his property and had nothing to do with the indigo plantation owner. He also revealed shocking details how he and the white master had conspired to sell Aminata's newborn daughter for a small profit. With all the evidence laid bare, the case completely collapsed. The judge ordered the indigo plantation owner to leave the courtroom immediately. As for Aminata, who was still legally marked as a slave, the law required that she be returned to the Jewish merchant, but to everyone's surprise, the merchant refused. He declared that he would give Aminata her freedom. The long nightmare was finally over, and Aminata left the courtroom with her head held high. She ignored the merchant's apologies and expressions of regret. Forgiveness was something he would never earn. Later, at the harbor, she said a heartfelt goodbye to the innkeeper who had risked everything to help her. During those painful years, the man had developed deep feelings for her, but Aminata already had a husband, and she could never betray the man she truly loved. So, she boarded the ship bound for Nova Scotia, hoping that one day, she would be reunited with her husband. But what awaited her there was far from the freedom she had imagined. In the so-called refuge for freed slaves, life was harsh beyond belief. A black man was publicly hanged just for stealing a few potatoes. The people there suffered from cold and hunger, and compared to the white settlers, the black refugees lived in unbearable hardship. Aminata, as a prominent member of the Loyalist group, also arrived on the island, but safety was an illusion. While searching for a place to settle, she was suddenly confronted by a starving white man who began harassing her. As the two struggled, Cummings happened to pass by and immediately rushed over to intervene. The white man pulled out his musket and shouted at him to stay out of it, mocking and threatening him. But in the chaos, Cummings grabbed a rock and struck the man on the head, killing him instantly. He told Aminata not to worry. In Nova Scotia, death was common, and no one would care enough to investigate. They quickly left the scene, but that very night, there was a loud knock at the door of the black settlement. It was the dead man's mother. This old woman was no ordinary figure. She was wealthy, well-connected, and held significant influence in the region. She immediately accused the local black community of being responsible for her son's death. Even without proof, she vowed to make them pay. The next day, she began rallying local merchants, claiming that these foreign blacks were stealing their limited resources. Her words spread fast, and many white traders agreed with her, pledging to drive the black settlers out. Meanwhile, not far away, Cummings was working hard, chopping wood as usual. The angry merchants decided he should be punished too. At that moment, one white man stepped forward, explaining that Cummings was his hired worker and begging the others to calm down. Aminata, sensing the danger, urged Cummings to flee immediately, but the man refused. He believed that as long as he did his work honestly and harmed no one, he would be safe. He was wrong. Moments later, The mob arrived, weapons in hand, their faces filled with rage. The air grew tense, and then a single gunshot rang out. Cummings fell to the ground. The old woman, filled with malicious glee, shouted loudly that justice had been served, and the other white settlers echoed her cry with cheers. Aminata glared at the scheming murderer with eyes full of hatred, condemning the woman's shameless cruelty. This deep-rooted prejudice, the hatred of black lives, had never changed. Determined to seek justice, Aminata went to the home of a British officer, pleading for help. Without hesitation, the officer grabbed his musket and rushed out the door, telling Aminata to stay put and not move. Could it be that things were finally going to change? But that night, chaos returned. A mob of armed locals stormed toward the black settlement, their shouts echoing through the darkness. At the same time, a young black man, driven by rage, broke into the old woman's house with a knife in hand. Without a word, he stabbed her repeatedly, clearly avenging his fallen brothers. The old woman staggered out the door, cursing him viciously, while two white men passing by witnessed the scene. Aminata saw it all from her window and tried desperately to warn the young man, shouting for him to run, but it was too late. Moments later, he fell to the ground, killed before her eyes. Aminata could no longer bear the pain of losing yet another of her people. In the distance, fires raged, the flames lighting up the night with horror. At dawn, she followed the smoke to the site of the destruction. The ground was littered with the bodies of black men and women. It was a massacre. Shaken, she sought out an old friend, the same British officer who had once helped maintain peace. He warned her that they needed to leave immediately, or they too would be killed. But Aminata refused to go. She had not yet found her husband. Then, as if heaven had heard her cries, she called out his name again and again, until at last, the man appeared before her. Perhaps all their suffering had finally come to an end. Together, the couple joined nearly 2,000 other escaped slaves, boarding a ship bound for West Africa, dreaming of the home and happiness that had lived only in their memories. When the freed blacks arrived in Sierra Leone, the British helped them build a new town called Freetown, and at long last, Aminata and her husband could live side by side again. But the world had not changed. Slavery still thrived in the shadows. One day, Aminata saw a young black boy in chains, and it felt like looking at her younger self. Out of pity, she offered the boy a cup of water, but the cruel slave trader struck it from her hands with a violent slap. Aminata knew exactly what awaited those children, a fate of pain and bondage. Driven by fury, she gathered others and followed the traffickers to the beach, determined to stop the inhuman trade once and for all. Enraged by her interference, one of the slavers grabbed her husband and held a weapon to him. At the last second, a British officer offered valuables in exchange, and Aminata's husband was released unharmed, but he refused to walk away. His only thought was to save the child. The officer, furious at his defiance, warned him not to interfere again. Then, an elderly black man stepped forward, urging everyone to calm down, reaching out with his hands to feel for the missing child. The man was blind, relying on touch to recognize others, and when he finally found the boy, he pulled him into a tight embrace. The sight infuriated the slavers, who ordered him to hand the child back. Instead, the old man tried to lead the boy away, but one of the slavers caught up and stabbed him in the chest. The crowd erupted in panic. Gunshots cracked through the air as British soldiers fired warning shots to restore order. Aminata, horrified, stumbled to the fallen man's side. This was the man who had once helped her, a man who had endured a lifetime of slavery under white oppression, only to die at the hands of his own people. And at that moment, Aminata finally understood. No matter how loyal she had been to the British, no matter how hard she tried to believe in justice, she was powerless to change the brutal reality of the world. After everything she had endured, Aminata and her husband decided it was time to return to their long-lost home, the village of Bayo. Her husband agreed without hesitation, and under the guidance of a local escort, the two began their long journey back to the land of their birth. But they had no idea that an even greater danger was quietly approaching. As they passed through a dense jungle, they suddenly came face to face with the same slave trader from before. The trade in human lives was still thriving. Aminata's eyes fell upon a small, terrified girl, and her heart trembled. It was like staring into her own past. She tried to offer the child a sip of water, but the slaver barked a threat, warning that anyone who interfered would share the same fate: enslavement. Forced to hold back, Aminata and her husband retreated into the shadows, secretly planning to rescue the captives once night fell. When the camp finally went silent and the fires burned low, her husband slipped away to free the prisoners, telling Aminata to stay hidden in the tall grass. At first, everything went smoothly. He unfastened the young girl's shackles and helped her escape. From her hiding place, Aminata watched with her heart pounding, praying for him to stay safe. But fate was cruel. Just as he freed the last captive, a patrolling slaver spotted him. Knives flashed in the darkness as a desperate fight broke out. Seeing him in danger, Aminata rushed forward to help. But tragedy struck. The slaver was killed, and her husband was mortally wounded in the struggle. He died in her arms beneath the silent jungle sky. Aminata was left shattered. She had lost the only family she had left in the world. 2 days later, she finally reached her childhood village of Bayo. There, she shared every detail of her journey with her people, from the day she was captured at age 11 to the countless trials she had survived since. Time passed, and 10 years slipped quietly by. Now an important figure among those loyal to the British, Aminata was invited to London, where she was treated with respect by the very people who had once enslaved her. She completed her great work, the Book of Negroes, a detailed record of the 3,000 black soldiers who had fought and died for the British cause, an indelible mark in history. In recognition of her service, the British government officially lifted her slave status and granted her permanent freedom. Then, a high official brought astonishing news: her long-lost daughter was alive. She had been brought to London years ago by Aminata's former employer, the Jewish merchant who had once betrayed her. Overwhelmed with emotion, Aminata rushed to the hotel where her daughter was staying, her heart filled with fear and hope. Would her daughter recognize her? Would she want to? But the moment their eyes met, every fear dissolved. They embraced, and Aminata realized that all the pain, all the struggle, all the years of surviving had led to this moment. And so, the story came to an end. The Book of Negroes, set against the brutal backdrop of the 18th century slave trade, tears open the blood-stained veil of colonial history. Through Aminata's journey of exile, it weaves a story of freedom, identity, and awakening. From being sold by her own people in Africa, to the plantations of America, to the revolutionary turmoil of New York, to the frozen isolation of Nova Scotia, and finally back to the jungles of Africa, Aminata's life is both a chronicle of suffering and a testament of defiance. When African slavers signed contracts to sell their own kin, when New York revolutionaries shouted all men are created equal yet refused to seek black men beside them, and when freed blacks in new settlements still lived in poverty and prejudice, the line between civilization and barbarism blurred beyond recognition. In the end, this story transcends tragedy to become a song of double awakening. When Aminata and her daughter, separated for 20 years, finally reunited across the Atlantic, their embrace reflected not only the scars of a mother and child but the wounds of an entire civilization. As power continues to disguise greed as progress, and as minorities still wander through the maze of identity, who truly has the right to define civilization? And all those silenced voices, the forgotten, the oppressed, the enslaved, will one day write their truth in flesh and blood upon the parchment of history, etching forever their own Book of Negroes. Alright, that's my reflection on the novel and series. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thanks for watching. See you next time.